Hi, everyone. I'm Mary Kay Lombino, and I want to welcome you to today's Thursday night talk, the second in our series so far. And I'm here to just give you a couple of housekeeping notes about how we'll conduct our evening. I will introduce the speaker, and then we'll allow our speaker to give his talk, and then while he's speaking, please feel free to think of questions and type them into the Q&A box on your screen. You can click on the little Q&A icon at the bottom and then type away. And then I will be reading those off one by one after the talk so that we can have Griffin answer the questions. So I will start with a short introduction of Griffin Pion, our speaker today, who is joining us from Los Angeles. Griffin graduated from Vassar this May with a double major in art history and philosophy. He's currently the summer curatorial assistant at the Loeb and will pursue a master's in philosophy at St. Andrews in Scotland next fall. During his senior year at Vassar, Griffin, or actually his 4 years at Vassar, he was a member of the Loeb Student Committee and was a student assistant in the curatorial department for 3 of those years. During his senior year, he wrote 2 theses, a philosophy thesis on Ludwig Wittgenstein's conception of confusion, and an art history thesis on Gustave Courbet. Griffin's art history thesis, titled Realistic Reproduction, explores how lithographic and photographic reproduction technology affects contemporary understanding of Courbet's artwork, and we will hear a little bit about that in a few minutes. For his academic work, Vassar's art history department awarded Griffin the Weitzel-Barber Art Travel Prize for archival research in France and Germany, as well as the Gertrude Buttenweiser Prins Prize for originality, independence, and excellence in the study of art history. Vassar's philosophy department also awarded Griffin the Philip Nachlan Prize for an exceptionally good senior thesis and the Jamie Niss Greenberg Philosophy Prize for overall excellence in philosophy. So that's quite a number of awards. Congratulations, Griffin, on your graduation and on your rewards. And you can take it away.
Okay, let me share my screen. Okay. All right, can everyone see this? Yes, okay, cool. So thank you, Mary Kay, for the introduction. And today I'm going to be talking about these 2 works that you see before you by the French artist Gustave Courbet. So first, it's worth saying a few words about who Courbet was. Courbet was born in a small town called Ornans, which is in the French provinces near the border of Switzerland in 1819. And in the late 1840s and 1850s, he rose to prominence as one of the champions of the painting movement called realism. And the 2 works that I'll focus on are a painting, which you see on the left, of Jean Journet, and he made that for the Paris Salon of 1850 and 51. And then on the right, you see a lithographic version of the same figure that Courbet made shortly after finishing the painting. And the one on the right is in the Loeb's collection. So these 2 works testify to Courbet's desire to break out of the confines of the official French Salon mode of painting, because Courbet wanted his art to assume a more active and political role in society. But to see how these 2 works, which today seem relatively innocuous, could have been potentially provocative, it's necessary to explain 2 features of their context. So first, we need to understand the particular political situation in which they were created, the political situation in 1850 in France. And second, we need to examine the popular image culture that existed in the French provinces in the middle of the 19th century. So here we see a cartoon made by the cartoonist and political commentator Honoré Daumier, and it frames well the political situations in France at the time. So Courbet made this painting in 1850, or his paintings and his lithograph, but in 1848, there had just been a huge revolution in France. And the king at the time, King Louis Philippe, had abdicated the throne. And one of the first changes that was instituted was universal male suffrage. So what that meant was 3 million new voters, largely from the French provinces, had for the first time the right to vote and influence French politics nationwide and in the French capital of Paris. And so both parties, the revolutionaries and the conservatives in Paris, realized that to gain support in this new political situation, they would have to appeal to the masses on a level that they had never seen before. So what they did was they began printing popular images in the form of broadsheets, which were basically the size of newspaper, a spread with text and images, or almanacs, which were calendars with news and horoscopes and things like that, and pamphlets. And this image culture already existed in the provinces. People were already using these types of documents in their everyday life. But what the politicians in Paris did was they kind of adopted these forms and politicized them in a new way to try and almost indoctrinate the provinces and the French citizenry outside of Paris by inserting subtle and not so subtle political messages into these images. So that's the existing context in which Courbet made his works. So there was a politicized moment, and there was a very clear use of images in this moment to try and garner support from the French countryside. So the next question we come to is, who is this person in Gustave Courbet's paintings that we see here, named Jean Journet? So this is a photo of Jean Journet taken by Nadar. And Journet was a well-known socialist eccentric in France during the 1840s and early 50s. And he was an ardent supporter, he actually called himself an apostle, of the early utopian socialist Charles Fourier. Journet was known for wandering around France and Brussels, distributing pamphlets and singing songs about Fourier's ideas, and trying to drum up support for these ideas. And so in painting Journet and making a broadsheet of Journet, Courbet seemed to be aligning himself with one of the dominant strains of socialism at the time, attaching himself to it and depicting him in a way that testified to his importance and placed him in a context that was reserved for generally kings and myths in the French Salon. So now these are some examples of the popular broadsheets that would have circulated during this time. And this is a particular type of broadsheet that depicts a particular scene called Le Juif Errant, or the Wandering Jew. So the Wandering Jew has a deep history in France and Paris, but basically the story is that during the time when Jesus was alive and when he was being taken to the Mount Calvary to be crucified, he passed by a shoemaker who was making his shoes, and Jesus asked him whether he could rest in front of his shoemaking shop and house. And the shoemaker didn't have mercy on him and said no, and in fact called him a criminal. And since the Jew was not merciful towards Jesus, Jesus condemned him to eternal wandering throughout the countrysides until the second coming of Christ. And so this story, which was both a testament to Jesus's powers and a lesson that one should be merciful towards even strangers, became something of a folk story told in the French countryside, and also a stock type of image that was used. So that's what we see here. We see three broadsheets. The two on the left are variations of the same image, but reversed. And they would have been, one is hand colored, one is colored with a stencil. And then on the right, you see a bit more of a modern take. on the same theme. And so Courbet, let me advance. Courbet, in making his painting, he's drawing on the specific image style that were in these Wandering Jew prints. So we can see here that Courbet is using the palette specifically. So he uses these bright reds and greens, and you have these earth tones on a hill that he's walking, in addition to the general figure position that's very identifiable and would have resonated with viewers at the time. And so in doing so, Courbet is adopting the forms of a politically charged print culture. So we must remember that in this time, these prints were being politicized in a new way in order to drum up support for the provinces. And he was also depicting a politically inflammatory person who was real and who was known within literary and artistic circles in Paris, Jean Journet. And Courbet's explicit aim in doing this was to provoke the official Salon public. So in a letter to his friend that he wrote, Courbet said that he thought the painting was going to shock the Salon so much that the French government would have to put an armed guard to defend it from people who would want to destroy the painting. And then after Courbet had finished the painting, he made a lithographic image, which you see there, and printed it on a broadsheet surrounded by text in the same form as we see in these popular broadsheets, where you have the image, then you have the text. And in addition to this, this use of the composition of these popular prints, Courbet also engaged with certain specific features of them. So, for example, on the Wandering Jew prints, they all tell a similar story, and there's minor variation between the different renditions, but they're all supposed to be sung to a folk tune that would have been known to the audience who was reading it. So you were meant to read it and sing out the lines that you're reading, and those lines told the story of the Wandering Jew. And so Courbet does the same thing. He writes in the top right corner of his text, you can see very, very small there, I'll point at it right here. He says, Air de Joseph, which was a well-known folk tune at the time. And the text written out was supposed to be sung. So that's echoing back to these Wandering Jew prints. But in the case of the Wandering Jew, the text is about how one must have mercy, or else they may suffer serious consequences, like endlessly wandering the countryside. And the text tells the story as a kind of a threat to or not a threat, but a warning to the reader. And in the case of Courbet's broadsheet, the text is Courbet's own voice. So, excuse me. The text is Journet's own voice, which Courbet juxtaposed with the image. And the text encourages the reader to take up the Fourierist cause, basically as a panacea to modern society's ails. And in pairing Journet's text with an image of Journet, Courbet is almost enacting a type of political identification. So the reader is literally supposed to sing his words about what he's seeing, about how terrible society is, and how we can fix it, namely adopting socialism. The reader is supposed to sing those to Journet. So they're almost embodying Journet's own voice. And in the context of calling for revolution, this seems to be a sort of class identification. And it seems like in making this broadsheet, Courbet's aim is to actually galvanize a Fourierist revolution. I know it may sound kind of bold, but he really seems to be calling for revolution in a very real way, and he's not doing so in the art context. So by that I mean, it's important to note that he's not merely taking the forms of popular art, so the colors as we saw in the painting and the figure position, and taking that and then making it into fine art and showing it in the salon setting. But he's actually making a popular image. He's printing it on, he used the presses that were printing popular imagery, and he disseminates it the same way. So there's numerous copies of this print because he did print it as a popular image. And it wasn't meant to be regarded as an art object, but it was supposed to be used and passed around as these popular broadsheets were in the countryside. But of course, the broadsheet failed to cause a Fourierist revolution. There was not a Fourierist revolution in France. And over time, we see this recurrent depoliticization of the image, where its political tones would be neutralized in various ways in both the study of art history and how it's treated in museums. So let's see what I mean by that. So here we have on the left a version of the broadsheet that is at the Art Institute of Chicago. And then on the right, we have the version at the Loeb. So the figures in both are the same size. I've just blown up the one on the right so you can see it better. But on the one on the right that we have in the collection at the Loeb, the text surrounding the image has actually been cut away. So we see this in many instances, in many collections that have this print. We actually have a material cutting away of the text, which makes it read as a popular image. And instead, it's sublimated into a form of kind of an artist's edition or artist print that would have been a more recognizable form for print collectors. And so in the case of the Loeb, this is mounted in a way that's called a chine-collé, which is a printing technique where a usually delicate piece of paper, like the paper used for the broadsheet would have been, is mounted on a thicker piece of paper. And this makes it read more of a fine art object. But of course, as we've seen, this work was originally disseminated not as a fine art object, not as an artist's print made in some edition, but as a print that was disseminated widely. And Courbet, in fact, chose to use a printing press that was known for making the prints that other presses would take up and alter in some way and then print again with minor variations, as we saw in those Wandering Jew prints, how we have multiple prints. They vary in different ways between the prints, and you have this kind of chain of different prints being disseminated everywhere. So Courbet's using the press that led to that type of situation where you have this type of alteration going on. And so that's one way that this print is kind of politically neutralized. And another way that's not material, it's not physically excising the image, but is more discursive, is that when this image is usually reproduced in essays and books and in the Courbet literature generally, it's often reproduced solely as the image, as you see on the right, even when the work being cited, the museum credit given, is actually of a full broadsheet like the one you see on the left. And the surrounding text isn't talked about that often. So this seems to reflect a sort of art historical bias maybe, where the focus is on the image and looking at the figure and the position and Courbet's use of lithography, but it's not taken into consideration that this image is supposed to play with the text in a specific way. And as a result, we miss this very particular political resonance where we are singing the words, calling for revolution to a revolutionary. And as a result, you just lose the type of use that the image would have originally been used for. Great, yeah, that is my talk.
Thank you, Griffin. That is fascinating, and I love that it's a work in the Loeb collection. It's wonderful when our students can use the collection for their research, and especially when it gets incorporated into a senior thesis, because we learn from this as well, and this will become part of the permanent record for that object in our collection. So thank you for your research, and thank you for the talk. And let's see, I think so far we have one question, and this is from Bella Dalton-Felk, who you probably know, a fellow student. What happened when Courbet tried to submit the painting to the Salon? Was it hung?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it would have likely not been hung, except Courbet the year before at the Salon had won a medal for one of his paintings. And when you won a medal at that time, you would receive this special status called hors concours, which means basically like outside of the jury. So then as a result, you could submit however many paintings you wanted, and they would have to be accepted basically. So as a result, Courbet had just won that status by receiving a medal for a painting made the year before. And so he submitted this painting and it was hung, and he submitted some other paintings that were also very charged and that people were very upset about, but the Salon just had to hang them.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for the question. And I want to insert one question of my own that I was thinking about in terms of what the public response was to the work when it was first, to Courbet's painting, when it was first came out. You said it didn't create a revolution, but did anything happen?
That's a good question. Well, this painting wasn't as provocative and didn't receive the response he had hoped for, but some other paintings at that same salon, which may be more familiar to people interested in art history, such as the Stonebreakers or or No, those were hung in the same salon, and those have become examples of particularly charged images that kind of disrupted critical consensus, and people really thought about them in a serious way. Yeah.
Great, that's great. And a question from Dominic Canino that says, does anyone know the origin of the story of the Wandering Jew? I know you mentioned a little bit of what the story is, but are you able to take us back a bit into the history of that?
It's a very, I don't think that anyone knows the true origins, because it did really start as a folk tale that was told. And there's history of it back to, I think the earliest I've read that's recorded is in, I forget, but I want to say before the 1600s. And it was, yeah, there's records of it in Germany, there's records of it in France, obviously, and it even traveled to England as well. So it's quite an old story that was changed, and so it's hard to track. And since it was a folk story for most of its existence, it wasn't recorded in ways that are, you know, preserved very well. Yeah, but actually, Lindsay Cook in her talk last week mentioned that, and I didn't know this, that there's a statue gargoyle figure on Notre Dame of the Wandering Jew, which is super fascinating, and it just shows the ways that this story spread into many different types of culture.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I have a question from Professor Nesbitt, who says hello. And she would like to know if you can talk a little bit about the year the Loeb acquired the print, 1973, which was in the time during Linda Nochlein's teaching at Vassar, and that she had published realism. So can you talk a little bit about the thrust of her Courbet scholarship? So really like the political frame that's being made quite differently in its Vassar context.
That's a hard question. Well, so Linda Nochlin is one of the most well-known scholars of Courbet, and also taught at Vassar. And she wrote her dissertation on Courbet, and the main thrust of her Courbet scholarship is a critical reevaluation of the political import and political nuance of his paintings. So before her scholarship, many had tried to divorce Courbet from his political stances. So he was almost sanitized as an artist. And there was a lot of emphasis on his later works, which were mostly landscapes, and de-emphasis on his early works that are very politically charged. But Nochlein's dissertation, which was written in the 60s, totally upset that notion of Courbet and really showed that he was a very rigorous political agent. And now the second part, thinking about the year that the Loeb acquired the print, it's a very hard question. And so after Nochlin wrote her dissertation, her first book was Realism, which was a kind of sociological look at the movement of realism beyond just Courbet's painting, and it spread to Germany, France, and England. And that was really a path-breaking book. It was nominated for the National Book Award, and it continued a lot of the insights she had in her dissertation. And then in the year that it was acquired, that was when Vassar, just I think 4 years before, had gone co-ed. And I'm forgetting when Nochlin published Why Have There Been No Great?
1971.
71, so exactly. So yeah, there's a lot of very charged work coming out. I don't know specifically about the impetus for acquiring the print, but I'm sure it's wrapped up in many different tensions there.
Thank you. And the next question I have is from Jessica Breyer, who says, thank you, Griffin. Can you talk a little bit about the translation of the image of Jean Journet from painting to print? And what does that reversal of the image's orientation and the loss of color do to the image? And does it have some change in the relevant, and is it relevant to its political efficacy?
That's a really good question. Well, there's kind of a story behind the answer to this question. So Courbet, just before he had painted the painting, he had been traveling through the French countryside, and he had been in towns that were known as very politically charged and would have been the epicenters of this type of political image culture, especially leftist cultures, because so specifically a town called Besançon and a town called Dijon, which is more well known. And so he had just been living for multiple months in these situations that had political images and also had government censorship of those images. So he really knew the power of them at the time. And so first he returns from those towns, and the first thing he does is make the painting for the Salon. But then the second thing he does is, after he finishes the painting, he makes the broadsheet, a popular print. So my best guess is that he was trained as a painter, and the Salon was where he understood how to make the biggest splash. So that was kind of his first thought. But he had also been seeing these prints just before making the painting. So I also think that that's a huge motivation, and he could see the power that making such a painting could have outside of the Salon setting. And then as for the translation of the image, there's basically two different theories about the reversal of the image. So some people think that Courbet didn't really understand lithography that well, and he didn't realize that when you make the lithograph and it's printed, it reverses. Then there's another reading that basically holds that Courbet was playing with this reorientation of the image, perhaps as an engagement with this type of medium. I'm not sure which one is right, but it's definitely worth thinking about more. And then the color, I think, is really important. So one thing about the color printing in the broadsheet is that usually broadsheets were black and white, and only when they would become very popular would printers go the extra effort to either make a stencil to color them or hand color them. So I think part of the reason that it's black and white is just because the technology didn't allow for black and white printing yet for this mass-produced image. And are those changes relevant to its political efficacy? That's an interesting. I'm honestly not sure how differently broadsheets were responded to that were black and white and ones that were color. I would guess that people were more attracted to the color ones because they catch your eye more, but I really don't know.
Okay, we have a few more questions. This one is from Chase Pion. I assume this person is related to you. Do you think that Courbet was overly hopeful about the masses' ability to understand all the intricacies of what he was trying to portray and insinuate in the broadsheet? Or were the masses in France at the time educated enough to understand what he wanted them to understand?
That's a good question. Well, at the time, the the masses weren't very educated in a formal sense in the provinces, but their politics were being discussed very vigorously. And as I said, in those towns he was visiting, political conversation was a very great subject of conversation. So people were thinking about revolution and thinking about socialism in a very serious way. And we have evidence that even in these provincial towns, people were considering Fourierism and other forms of socialism. As for understanding all the intricacies, I'm not sure that all the intricacies of his work needed to be understood for it to be effective, because in adopting the familiar forms of the popular press, I think Courbet is making a really ingenious move in that it's almost like he's trying to speak the same language to say something new as the masses. So he's using things, and they may not think, okay, he's playing with the Wandering Jew print and playing with the colors, but in the same way that we all are familiar with certain types of photographs because we deal with them a lot, and as a result, it's easier to understand those photographs. I think he's doing something similar. So he's using this type of photograph, or not photograph, this type of image and certain features of it in order to kind of speak the same language as the people he's speaking to.
That's great. Thank you. The next question is from Jane Levinson, who says, do you know what the painting was that got Courbet the award that allowed him to enter this painting? Was that painting political as well?
Yeah, so that painting was, it's called After Dinner at Ornans, and it was shown at the 1849 Paris Salon. It's not explicitly political, but people have read political meanings into it. You can look at it for yourself and tell me what you think. But it is basically three men sitting at a dinner table after dinner, and another man on the right. He's playing music for them. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Patricia Deneroff, and it's more of a question about you and your studies. Do you find that your interest in philosophy influences how you think about art history?
That's a hard question. I think it does in certain ways. I think it does in certain ways. So most of my art history studies have been of modern and contemporary art history. And I think, at least if our aim is to understand what artists are doing, I prefer to stay with the types of philosophical ideas that they would have been thinking about, and not kind of retroject our ideas or later ideas onto them. But at the same time, I think that understanding philosophical ideas of any historical period is in some sense philosophy. So I think it does influence my thinking, but I try to be careful to not let it influence my thinking too much.
Well, we have time for one more question, and I have another one for you that has to do with that transformation from the broadsheet and the cutting down of the image, and sort of when that would happen in the life of the print. And did it then really spur on a lot of public collections like the Loeb or other museums to begin collecting more of these, since broadsheets didn't often enter into museum collections back then?
Yeah, I'm not sure when historically in the life of a print they would have been cut down, but I do think that they were cut down because, as you kind of gestured at, they do resemble something that would have been familiar to the print connoisseur. And if you presented them with a broadsheet, it would have either looked like something that wasn't valuable because it looked like a popular image, or they just wouldn't have really been able to understand. Whereas the artist lithograph was a very recognizable form, especially in the mid-19th century. So you have artists like Delacroix making these, who's a painter, and he's making these lithographic editions that were sold. And so a lot of prominent artists were experimenting. So I think that it was almost a market-driven move, just to make them resemble these things more. But I'm not sure when in the life of the print that would have happened. It's interesting if you just Google the print and look at the different public collections that have them, that there's maybe, I haven't really, tabulated the exact numbers, but a 50-50 split between the ones that are cropped and the ones that aren't. And there's just no evidence that Courbet ever made one that didn't include the text. So if you think about the act of actually excising and changing the broadsheet, and that's kind of, a significant decision to make. And then you think that about half of the ones that we still have were like that. It seemed like a very compelling decision, that a lot of people were making.
Yeah, and quite common. Okay, I told you that was the last question, but there is actually one more question from an anonymous attendee who wanted to know, how was Courbet received in political circles?
That is a very good question. He was, that's such a hard question. There's so much to cover there, but it changed throughout his lifetime. So at some points, like when he was making these paintings, he was seen as a real political force, as a painter that could represent somewhat complex politics of the time. So the political theorist Proudhon took up Courbet as kind of a model for what socialist painting should be. But then later he was taken less seriously. And then that culminated with, in 1871, there was an uprising in Paris, the Paris Commune, and there was a large column to Napoleon. And Courbet was somehow involved in the destruction of that column. And afterwards, that revolution was suppressed. And as a result, he was kind of viewed as a dirty figure in the history of French painting, as too political to deal with. And he was, his political actions were viewed as basically naive. And his painting was worth saving, but we shouldn't really view his politics. And that's actually what I mentioned before with Linda Nochlin having revived the political import. That's part of it. So we have his depoliticization after he was involved in that revolution until the 1960s and early 70s with other art historians like T.J. Clark, who really revised that and showed that it was important.
Great, thank you. Well, we're going to wrap up. I want to thank you again for all of your work and research on this object and for presenting this. And I want to just tell our audience that we're so glad that you could join us, and please stay tuned, because we will continue to host conversations like this with scholars and artists, and they're usually on Thursday nights, so keep an eye on your email and our social media and our website for more to come. And thanks again. Thank you, Griffin.
Thank you, everyone.